Welcome back, listeners. I am very excited for another episode of the Writer's Advice podcast because today we are joined by the fabulous rom-com author, Mazey Eddings, who is, you've got two beautiful books under your belt that I really want you to dive into soon. And most recently, Lizzie Blake's Best Mistake. But I would love to know how this journey started for you and when was the first moment that you realized that you were a writer?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on. And oh gosh, you know what? Sometimes I still don't feel like a writer in a lot of ways. Like I feel like I'm just really doing a good job pretending to be one most of the time. Which is a really long-winded way to say I have imposter syndrome. But I think one moment that like truly stands out to me was when I got an offer from my agent, because it was the first time that I had ever had kind of like a publishing professional validate my work. And so I remember I was walking home and it was like a fall day. It was probably almost about 4 years ago, almost to the day. And I was walking home from school and just feeling like, honestly, I was just feeling like shit. I was like, like this isn't going anywhere. I'm like, hitting my head against a brick wall. And I got an email and it was just like, it felt like the world stopped spinning. Like I was just so excited. And so, that was one of those light bulb moments that just felt really, really amazing. And then in a lot of ways, I feel like, so, A Brush with Love and Lizzie Blake's Best Mistake felt very easy to write in the sense that like I was constantly inspired to get words on the page. But my third book, which comes out in April, was like, oh my God, it felt like pulling teeth the entire time I was writing it. And so now looking back, I almost feel like that was like initiation into real writerhood, where it's like I struggled so hard that I'm like, okay, that, that's what it took, because I didn't give up on that one.
Does that help get rid of a bit of the imposter syndrome? You're like, oh no, this is actually a job. Like this is hard.
It's funny because I was like, it was one of those. So that book is the third book, the plus one, is probably the most vulnerable thing I've written. And by the time, and I had to rewrite it too. And so by the time it was finally like accepted by my editor, and I was like, there's not going to be a person in this world that likes this book besides me. Like it is, I was like, everybody's going to hate it. Nobody's going to get it, blah, blah, blah. And in that moment I was like, and you know what, screw it, like that. Yeah, I like this, I put my whole heart into that book. So I guess in some ways it defied the imposter syndrome, or I was like, you know what, let's like really test out the imposter syndrome here. But I've had a couple early readers say it's their favorite in the series, and so that has been a little mind-blowing and like very validating.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And so that's April. I want to dive into a little bit more about that. But was A Brush with Love the first book that you ever wrote, or had you written stuff previously, but that was the first that, you went to publish?
That was the first that I ever finished. So it took me a long time to realize that I wanted to be a writer, because it almost felt like I've always had this idea in my head that writers are like these superhuman creatures, right? Where it's like, because storytellers throughout history have been so important and such like pillars of culture and things being passed down. And so in my head, I've always had writers on this huge pedestal where I'm like, that's not like, they're not even mortal, And so then I've like, slowly come to realize that like, oh no, we're just like, we're people too. And like, we're just fumbling around with everything else. But, I dabbled around with a lot of short stories and so many attempts at like starting books and just losing steam and losing focus. And so Brush with Love was the first one that I ever fully finished, and then took the time to also edit, which is a whole beast in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think I had practiced the craft of writing a lot, but never the craft of finishing.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people can relate to that. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And when was the moment then where you're like, okay, this is the story that I want to run with, essentially? Like you said, it came through you pretty easily, like it was just flowing through you. How do you pick, you're like, no, that's the idea I want to go with, essentially?
I think so. In so many times before that, I was kind of when I would sit down to work, I was kind of forcing a story or like this idea of what I wanted to tell or I wanted to say. And and it constantly felt like hitting roadblocks in a lot of ways because I would be almost at odds with my characters. Um, and I had a bit of a quarter life crisis around the time that A Brush with Love came to fruition. I was in my first year of dental school. I was like severely depressed, very, very anxious, like not having a good time. And I was turning to romance books and I had really bad insomnia. So I was reading like, a book a night. And it just was such a balm to my anxiety and, everything I was going through. And like I said, writing was something that I'd always toyed with, but never like believed I could do. And throughout my life, my mom had always said like, because, she was a single mom raising that. I promise there's a point to this, like, long babbling story, but my mom was a single mom that raised me. And so there was a lot of tears, a lot of drama all the time. And, when we would come through a hump of like particular melodrama, she'd be like, you're going to write one hell of a book one day. And I think we thought it would be quite a different type of book, more of like a reflective memoir on trauma. And then my boyfriend, I don't know why, he just always had it in his head too that I should write a book. And it was something that I was like super hesitant to share with anybody, that I had this desire to do. But he, from the start that I met him, was kind of like, saying like, you should write a book and blah, blah, blah. And he pushed that idea again when I was having this like crisis in dental school. And he's like, why don't you revisit writing? Why don't you? And I'm like, what am I going to write about? An anxious girl in dental school, like having a bad time? And he's like, yeah, maybe. And so, I thought about this idea a lot. And then Harper and Dan popped into my head as these very voicey, very vocal, and very like fully fleshed characters. And they would not stop talking until I started writing down their story. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like they popped into my head and they told me what they wanted their story to be. And it wasn't so much as like I was dictating where this book would go or settling on this idea. It was more just like almost this compulsion to like keep writing because they were talking to me and they were so excited about it. And that was the same for the whole friend group too. So, yeah, that was like a really long-winded story, and I apologize.
No, that's a great story. I love that so much. And your boyfriend, what an angel. Oh my God,
I
love
know,
that.
I know. Yeah, I have like this very distinct memory too, because we were living in Philly at the time. And so it was like January 2019 that I started writing Harper and Dan's book. And I took a really long time to tell him, because I was like, oh, I'm never gonna finish this. Like, it's probably silly, like blah, blah, blah. So I like didn't share it for a while because I didn't want to have the embarrassment of being like, oh yeah, I gave up on that. But we were on the subway, we were heading to dinner, and he kind of like stooped down to look at me, and he's like, where are you right now? And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, you're in a different world. You're like a million miles away. And that was when I admitted to him, well, I think I'm writing a book. and yeah, and so then he opened the floodgates, and it was all I've talked about for like 5 years now.
I love this so much. That is such a beautiful story. And I also love those moments where it's like you just need almost like, it can just be one sentence or one little push from someone that completely opens up, or like lets you see things in a different like. I love how you said the characters really came to you like that too. They're my favorite stories, especially when writers like, no, like these characters were literally sitting next to me while I was writing this story. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, same with Lizzie and Rake. And like, I mean, they're all just constantly yelling at me. And I feel like I found like a socially acceptable way to say that I have voices in my head.
It is like that is the best thing. I feel like so many writers can relate to that. That is so great. Now can you give, if anyone hasn't read your books before, can you give us a little synopsis, and possibly if you're allowed to give us a tiny little bit of what to expect in April?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so A Brush with Love came out in March 2022, and it is about two dental students who reluctantly trade fillings for feelings as they confront the messy complexity of being an adult and not really being sure what that means. A huge central theme to it is living with an anxiety disorder and kind of how that influences your relationships with other people, your ability to connect with them. And yeah, it's definitely like a strangers to best friends to lovers story. Slow burn romance, but at the core of it, it's very much about two people choosing each other and choosing themselves in a world that often pushes us one way or another. And so then Lizzie Blake's Best Mistake, which just came out this month, September 6th, is about an ADHD erotic baker who, well, she starts an underground erotic baking scheme. And she is very much like anti-intimacy, anti-relationships. She's been burned a lot and been told her whole life that she's too much to handle. And so, her kind of method of self-care is one night stands and hookups without any feelings attached. In enters Rake, who is a gorgeous Australian visiting the States for work, and they have a two-night stand that ends up with a bun in the oven for our baker. And the two decide to quote unquote platonically co-parent despite their growing attraction. And they move in together, and it's very much forced proximity and trying to fight all the feelings, and very much opposites attract. And like I mentioned, it has ADHD rep and just kind of a look. I wanted to show a story where some sort of media where it wasn't like she overcomes the adversity of her disability, but instead it's just like a celebration of the way that her brain is wired. That was really important to me. And then the plus one, and these are all interconnected. And then the plus one is the final book in that series, which follows Indira, one of the best friends. She walks in on her boyfriend cheating on her in perhaps one of the weirdest ways possible. And like, to be totally honest with you, I can't believe they let me get away with it because it's so far. Like,
if that's not a hook for everyone to go and get this right now, I'm already like, oh.
I was like, I wrote this and I was like, you know what? It was almost like a chicken. I was like, let's see if they let this slide. And they did. So yeah, she obviously hauls ass out of there, and she seeks refuge at her brother's house, and he's in the middle of planning his wedding, and he's having this very extravagant wedding, and there's like 50 pre-wedding parties and blah, blah, blah. And when she gets to his house, her childhood nemesis, Jude, is there. And he is back from a 3-year stint practicing emergency medicine in high conflict areas. And they hate each other. They are not friends by any means. Like they kind of roast the hell out of each other. But Jude is dealing with a lot of trauma of what he's seen, and a huge theme of this book is PTSD. And so the two decide to reluctantly fake date because Indira's ex-boyfriend is also in the wedding party. And so they want to use each other as escapes from all of these wedding events. And then what do you know? These two nemesis fall in love.
I love
and
this.
yeah, and then, I'm gonna be honest, they still roast the hell out of each other up until the very end. Like they don't lose that aspect.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I'm
yeah.
so excited for this. That's April. That is
Yes.
absolutely amazing. Oh my gosh. Now there's so much out of that I want to ask you about. So firstly, the first book, A Brush with Love. When you're writing about, so you said you were going through like a pretty high anxious time in your life, and then you're writing about that. One, you're able to put so much realness in it, but two, did you find that very therapeutic for everything you're going through as well? Like, was that
I would say, in so many ways, I think every book has been cathartic in a different way. Because I do write about, mental health and mental illness is something that I've dealt with for as long as I can remember. Like I remember having my first panic attack when I was like 7 in first grade. And so it's always been like a big component for me. And it's funny, Harper is the character with anxiety, and I was trying so hard not to make her anxious. And I think I got a couple chapters in and I'm like, oof, sorry, girl. Like you got a generalized anxiety disorder. Like, oof, don't know what to tell you. And like, but in a lot of ways, I wrote that first book with the belief that nobody would ever read it. That was the first thing in my life that I had ever done fully and singularly for me and for the joy of doing it. And so, yeah, it was super cathartic. It was really unique to look at two people that in so many ways were very different from me. So Harper and Dan are very much individuals, and I see them as such, and I can relate to them in a lot of ways, but they aren't me. But it was like really cathartic to see them in an environment that I was in and watch them make choices where they prioritize themselves or they pursue things that are their passions and, allow them to find fulfillment, find love with each other, but also self-love. And yeah, so it was largely therapeutic and very cathartic, and almost a model to see how that could be, how that could happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much. And I want to talk about in your second book, you also mention ADHD. Now you come out and speak about being neurodivergent.
Yeah.
I like love how you mention this of like, no, it's not about like, it's not putting it into this, I don't want to say sob story, but it's like not turning it into that. And it's like, no, actually, this is a superpower. This is how her brain works. Yeah. This is, and bringing light to that. Because I actually don't think there's that much out there, like story-wise, to put that into something so beautiful like a rom-com. Yeah, how, like you must have received so much amazing feedback on that.
I feel incredibly humbled for how many people have connected with that. So yeah, I mean, I'm ADHD, I have autism. I kind of run the gambit of like the fun mental health situations. And but yeah, ADHD is something that I think is really, really misunderstood, especially how it's portrayed in media. So often we see it in this very male-centric lens, especially for adolescent males, right? Like we have very little tolerance and grace for adults that, actively demonstrate signs of ADHD. And then even less grace for women that have it. And, so many women go undiagnosed and are kind of white knuckling their way through life because they don't fit this very specific model that we've decided to create, to call the paradigm of ADHD. And so that was really frustrating, right? And then on the flip side, because I was kind of late getting diagnosed. I was in my 20s when I was diagnosed, and I was doing a ton of reading and trying to understand, it felt like I was like granted access to this whole new world where I could like understand myself better. And so many workbooks or books out there about ADHD really are written by neurotypical people and are written with the focus on what people with ADHD can do to change themselves, to make life easier for the neurotypicals around them, or make them more palatable to society, which, like, am I allowed to swear on here?
Yeah, but go for it.
Yeah. Fuck that. Like, that's so stupid. Like, I hate that. Like, ADHD brains are gorgeous and beautiful, and they're frustrating for the people that have them, but they also offer so much like complexity and feeling and different problem solving and creativity. And like, I feel so blessed to have this brain. And so, given the opportunity to write a character that is loved for her brain, never in spite of it, was just the biggest honor. And like, every time, I get a message from somebody that's connected with it, I get choked up because I'm also just very sensitive. So I get like all weepy. No, but I feel very humbled to be able to tell these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And putting them in, you're so right. Like, put these things in a fun, great light. You know what I mean? It kind of gets, it's boring of the trope to, like how you said, even PTSD is coming up in your next one, to always make it such negative. So, thank you for everything you do, Mazey. I think it's absolutely amazing.
No, I think there's this misconception, I see it on Twitter all the time, where it's this conversation about like what makes a rom-com, and like, can you have any sadness and stuff like that. And honestly, I think some of the funniest moments of my life have come when I was like depressed as hell and just like in my therapist's office, like miserable, and I say something hilarious and then we both laugh, and like, like that right there is healing.
Yeah.
And so I hate this idea that like trauma or rough patches or dark seasons in life are mutually exclusive from joy and laughter and happy endings and love. And so that's kind of what I try to go for in the books.
Absolutely. And like, obviously they've gone so well and so many people love them. And I'm so, what is it? A +1? Is that what you said? The
+1. Yeah.
The next one as well. The +1. Yeah. That is amazing. Now, Mazey, can you give some up and coming writers or someone who's maybe working on their first couple of manuscripts at the moment, what kind of advice would you give to someone who is currently in that position?
I think it's tricky because like, I always want to come up with something totally new and creative to share that like isn't told 1,000 times over. But for me, I feel like I become a stronger writer when I step back from the actual writing and read for the pure joy of reading. Mm-hmm. So I write in romance, and I read almost exclusively in romance. The mix-ups come with like historical or contemporary or paranormal or stuff like that. But getting to a point where it's not even that I'm reading a book for a study in craft or things like that, where I'm just reading for the joy of being lost in a story. I think that that's so invigorating and reignites that excitement to sit down at the keyboard and cut open the vein and put your heart into the story that you're working on. And so reading is such a crucial component of writing. And then I would also have to say, this process, writing, publishing, all of that, comes with a lot of rejection and a lot of hurt. Like I got a ton of rejection on submissions when I was querying. My book almost died on sub when I was out with editors. Like, there is so much rejection. And so I think it's really, really important early on to develop a connection with your work where you love it, but you know that your worth isn't tied to it. Because because so much heartache and hurt comes when you believe that your worth is tied to something, because that's what makes writing hard, right? Like we create art, but then the act of selling the book is consumerism. And so it's where these two almost at odd things meet. And so it's like, it's a total mind fuck. And like, it's very painful sometimes. So just, loving the process of writing and protecting the joy of that. And also just knowing that your worth as a human has nothing to do with how your book is received.
Yeah, absolutely. Those words are so beautiful. It's like loving it, but then being able to separate yourself from that at the same time. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I've had the best chat with you. I'm so thank you so much for joining me today. And your books are available everywhere, but where can people get in contact with you, see what you've got coming up next, etc.? Where's the best place to get in contact?
Yeah, well, I send out a very long-winded, shocking, sporadic newsletter. And so you can sign up for that on my website, mazeyeddings.com, MAZEYEDDINGS. And then I am also obnoxious on Instagram quite often. So that's at Mazey.Eddings. I'm trying to get into the TikTok game, and but like the problem is I like just keep wanting to like post soup content. Like I'm very into making soups right now, so it's like not very bookish, but we'll see. Might pivot. So on TikTok and Twitter I'm at Foxy Grandpa 27. So I probably need to change those handles, but
keep them there. That's the best. I love that so much. Oh, that is so great. Thank you so much for joining us, Mazey. And yes, everyone better go, if you haven't read one of your books before, go and purchase one of them now, because honestly it'll be the best, like especially feel good. I'm here in Australia now, so I feel like that really summer energy, like it's a really great read for the moment. So
oh my God, you're gonna make me cry.
Oh, thanks so much for joining me, Mazey.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast.